Okay, so here's the secret to the career path. Right now, you guys are standing right here. Oh, for shame, she's late. Okay, so right now you guys are standing right here, and everything looks higher up for you. And when you're at this age, at this point in your life, your thought is, I want to go as high as I possibly can. So, this is where everybody starts out, and I'm going to show you what really happens. You start out here, and you're going along, sure enough, you're following the line, but then at some point, you get to where going up farther, the benefit of moving up farther is offset by the things you would have to put up with by going up further. And so at that point, you reach what my wife and I refer to as either cruising altitude, if you're an American, or neutral buoyancy, if you're from, have you ever heard British people talk about neutral buoyancy?
No.
Oh, wow. So I learned that off the BBC. Okay, so it's basically this. You're not rising in the water, but you're not sinking.
Oh, I don't say.
What's that?
I don't go around boats, so that's
You don't go around boats. Okay. Anyway, so, hey, I don't blame you, right? So anyway, the point is this. At some point, it's not worth it to you going further up. I've told you guys before, I have no desire to do anything more than be a full professor. And it's,
Oh, for shame, she's late. Ha,
that's her name, right?
ha.
Okay. So, at some point, it becomes not worth it to you to go any further up. Now, here's the interesting thing. At this point, what has your life all been about? It's been about this climb. Now there's no longer the climb. You think you need something else in your life? Something meaningful? Can I tell you what that is? No, you got to figure it out for yourself. For me, it's toaster strudel. But, you guys know about toaster strudel? I'm kidding, I don't eat toaster strudel. Okay, so you've got to figure that out for yourself. But that's the horrible truth about career paths. Now, do some people continue on this path? Sure they do. But people that end up here, they're like 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, that sort of stuff. Most of us wind up there on the red line. Okay, questions? Okay, last time we were talking about acquisition of stock. And we said that we were going to make this tender offer, and in order to get all the shares that I need, I would basically keep raising my offer, but we said you got to have a number in your head and not go above that number. And we're going to talk about how you decide what the number is. So let's talk about the advantages of the acquisition of stock. First of all, no shareholder meeting needs to be held. If I've got 80% of the shares in the company, the shareholder meeting can be me by myself in a stall in the men's room at the Newark International Airport. It doesn't have to be anybody but me, right? Because I've got all of those shares. So we don't have to have the meeting. And secondly, it bypasses the target's management and board to appeal directly to shareholders. Now let's talk about, we talked about why the executives would not want to be taken over. Why do you think the board members don't want the firm to be taken over? Okay, so they chose the executives. Oh, by the way, do you think they play golf with the executives? Do you think the executive helped get one of their kids into a private school in Manhattan? It was very exclusive. I mean, there's all sorts of relationships there. That's number one. Number two, being a director is a pretty sweet gig, right? We're meeting 4 to 12 times a year, usually, and it's not Hoboken where they meet, right? It's going to be like Myrtle Beach or somewhere nice. They're going to have a nice time. And you know, they'll fly you in on the private jet. It's a pretty good deal. Plus, of course, it actually pays well too. And so, if you're getting merged with a new firm, let's say that there are 12 members on the bidding firm, there are 12 members on the board of the target firm. Do you think they're going to need 24 members on the new board? Absolutely not. And whose board do you think will be predominantly represented on the new board? The bidding firm, right? Because they're going to be the winner in this whole thing. And so the board is going to do very similar to what the target managers are doing. Even though the board members are hired by who? The shareholders to represent whose interests? The shareholders. So shouldn't they be interested in accepting an offer that's at a premium to the market price? Wouldn't that be maximizing shareholder wealth? But instead, we see the familiar scumbag effect coming into play here. Okay, now disadvantages. I love this first one. Can be unfriendly. The book says can be unfriendly. Folks, it's called a hostile takeover. Hostile, H-O-S-T-I-L-E, hostile. You're not getting along well, right? That's unfriendly. Target management can resist, and that will take the cost of the merger higher. Now, let's talk about if it's good for the target management to resist. The answer is yes, to a point. So the target management is supposed to be taking care of the target shareholders, right? If the target management can push the bid higher and sell at a higher price, that's better for their shareholders. And so the trick is they have to sell eventually, or those takeover defenses, which we'll talk more about, are not in the interest of shareholders. So there's a parallel here with what's going on right now in our world economy. Donald Trump throws out these tariffs. And the tariffs are good if they force people to the negotiating table and we're able to negotiate a deal that's better than what we've currently got. They're bad if they stay forever. And that's just like the takeover defenses. They're good if they push up the bid. They're bad if they prevent the takeover. Example, Yahoo. You guys have probably you probably haven't thought of Yahoo for years. But Yahoo was actually at one point more important than Google, right? So Google then comes in, kind of takes over the whole search engine scene. Microsoft wants to get a piece of the action, so they set out to buy Yahoo. There's only one problem. There's a guy at Yahoo named Jerry Yang. He's one of the original founders, and he's still very influential there. And so let's say that Yahoo starts off at $20 a share, and Microsoft offers $22. And Jerry says, no way. And so Microsoft keeps raising. And finally, Microsoft says, final offer, $28 a share. What should Jerry do? Take the money, right? Because that's maximizing shareholder wealth. He's selling a $20 company for $28. That's a good deal. But instead, Jerry stamps his feet like a 2-year-old and says, no, no, no. And Microsoft says, fine, and basically gives him that. What do you think happened to the stock price immediately? By the way, all through this thing, the stock price has been going up, right? Because Microsoft's offering more and more money. People are like, ooh, all you have to do is buy it for a little less than what Microsoft's offering, and I'll make some money. It gets up to, close to this $28 a share, and then Microsoft says, you know what, never mind. What do you think happens to the stock price? It goes back down. Where do you think it goes down to? Lower than it was. Why?
Microsoft doesn't want it, so why would anyone else want it?
Okay, how about this? Beforehand, people had priced in the possibility of Yahoo being taken over. And so it was traded. That $20 was more than the firm was actually worth because it incorporated a percentage chance of Yahoo being taken over. But now what do we know about Yahoo? What's Jerry going to do every time someone tries to take it over? Yeah, he's going to throw a fit, right? It's not going to happen. And so now Yahoo actually drops down to, say, $17 a share. Did Jerry live out the goal of financial management? Absolutely not. Questions? Okay.
So, okay, I know this is not relative to the bill, like Tesla stock is funding, right?
Okay.
And there might be a margin involved. Would that be the same situation for Yahoo if it reached a certain point? You have to get called out for that.
Okay, so you know what buying on margin is?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you buy stock on margin, it means you're buying stock with borrowed money, right? And so what happens, what they're talking about with Tesla is, if the stock price goes low enough, people who have bought it on margin, now they're going to either have to come up with some more money or they're going to have to sell stock because the broker is not going to allow themselves to get in a situation where they lose money because they're the ones that loan you the money to buy the stock, right? And so what happens when there's all these margin calls go out? Do you think these people all have all sorts of money to throw at this? No. What's going to happen then? How much stock's going to get sold? A bunch. And what happens to the price of stock when a bunch of it gets sold? It drops even further. And that precipitates more margin calls, and you might end up in some sort of death spiral. Now, here's the good news. If Tesla stock gets down to $2 or $3 a share, does that make them really easy to take over? Yeah. Assuming Elon doesn't have this other class of shares where he's got 10 votes. I don't know how they're set up. Now, well, what about Yahoo? I suppose something similar could have been going on with Yahoo. The other interesting thing is when you see the opposite side of it. Right now, what if he thought, aha, Tesla stock is going to go in the toilet, so I'm going to short it. You know what shorting is? Yeah. It's where you borrow the stock and then you sell it. What is the danger, though, when you short stock? Yeah, the price goes up, and then suddenly you're having to cover your shorts, which means you've got to buy this stock for more than you sold it for, and you get in a world of hurt. In fact, when we, at the beginning of this whole tariff thing, when it first hit, a lot of people shorted, right? And then when Trump announces like a 90-day pause and whatever, then the stock prices start to go up. A lot of those people were having to cover their shorts, which means they have to go out and buy stock. A bunch of people were buying a bunch of stock. What does that do to stock prices? Pushes it up. Did you hear what Trump said before he alleviated the pain? He's like, y'all need to buy stock, right? Yeah. Now, we have gone way off into the weeds here, but it was an interesting thing that you brought up. Questions? Yeah.
While we're off topic, let's stay there. Do you think that was market manipulation? 'Cause
Oh.
that's a big thing going on right now.
Okay, so here's the question. Is it market manipulation? Well, I can tell you this, there wasn't insider trading because guess what? The man stood up and told every single one of us to go out and buy stock. So in order for it to be a violation of insider trading laws, it would have to be material, non-public information. Was the information material? Yes. But was it non-public? No. Now, it would be interesting to see if Donald Trump and his inner circle bought a bunch of stock before he went out and made that announcement. That would be insider trading. And if you want to know about insider trading in politics, just ask Nancy Pelosi. She's an amazing investor. Amazing. Okay, other questions? Okay, now, next problem. Significant minority of your target shareholders could hold out. Remember, you're trying to get 80% or more to avoid having to pay taxes on the cash flows, or dividend taxes on the cash flows from that firm. And if you've got like 3 old soreheads that are preventing you from being able to get 80%, that makes things very difficult for you. And then finally, complete absorption actually requires a merger. So what this acquisition of stock is doing is instead of a merger, it is basically making a merger possible. So now we have to go back to the first thing and actually go through and do the legal merger. Questions? Okay, now let's assume that I can't get the target shareholders to vote to go along with this thing. I can't buy enough stock. What can I do? I can buy the assets of the firm. And it's really easy to buy assets of the firm comparatively. All you have to have is 50% plus 1 of the shares vote in your favor, not 80% like we saw earlier. And so this is actually, it sounds like an easy way to go about it. If I buy the assets of a firm, so let's say I'm buying everything, all the physical assets, all the intellectual property, all that sort of stuff, the company still exists when I get done with them. Now they're just basically a stock ticker symbol and a big pile of cash with a board of directors, and what those people should do is declare a liquidating dividend where that cash then gets sent out to their shareholders. But even after that, they still have something valuable. You remember that stock ticker that's out there trading? that actually has some value. If you go out to do an IPO from scratch, that's an expensive ordeal. But you could do what's called a backward merger into what's left after acquisition of assets, which is basically just a shell that you can back into. And in fact, we saw a lot of Chinese companies go public this way in the 2000s because they didn't want to undergo the expense or the disclosure and investigation that goes along with an IPO. So they would basically hermit crab themselves back into these leftover shells. Our government figured out what they were doing. It turns out most of these companies were frauds, and so that's not possible anymore. But that's how those shells came to be, is because there was a company out there that had its assets acquired. Now, it sounds really easy so far. You only have to have 50% plus one, and you're just paying for the assets. However, you remember we talked about when you go down to retitle the 2,000 rental cars, how much pain that is? This is where, when you do acquisition of assets, you have to retitle each individual asset. And of course, the nightmare example is the rental car company. Now let's talk about another problem that acquisition of assets avoids. So if I buy another firm, I am left to fire employees. By the way, anytime you put two firms together, they always say, oh, no one's going to lose their job. Folks, that is total bullshit. If anyone ever says nothing's going to change, no one's going to lose their job, you instantly know they're a liar. Because we're going to see the rationales for this. One of them is reducing costs. How do I reduce costs? Reduce people, right? Okay, now, if you are the acquiring firm, you are now responsible for getting rid of the excess people. My job on my 28th birthday was to fire 79 people from Dresser Industries. And we lined them up. And by the way, they had a union, and we did not. We did not want their union. Or we could have taken them on, but we would have had to take their union. So instead, what we did is we fired every single one of them, but we had a list from their managers of people that we want to keep. And so as I'm handing out the checks, the HR guy was standing next to me, and as someone would come by that we wanted to keep, he would give me the elbow, and I would say, let me encourage you to apply at our Beltline Road facility, right? And then the next one would come down the line, and the HR guy is like, I'm like, have a good life, right? So that was my job. Anyway, that I also put in my 2 weeks notice on that day. But that's a different story for a different day. Back to the main story here. What if I acquire the assets? I'm not responsible for getting rid of those people, right? Have you ever fired anyone? Anybody here ever fired anybody? Was it a pleasant experience? No. No. I mean, it was worse for them, but it's bad for you too, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the point is, it's rough to have to fire people. So you do the acquisition of assets, they've got to fire the people, they've got to take care of severance, they've got to take care of all that stuff. They're the ones that are going to have their porch light shot out, not you, right? Because when people get fired, they tend to get upset. Anyway, now what could we do though if it's the rental car agency? We've got the rental car counter. Let's say it's Hertz and Avis. Do you think the Hertz people can see what the Avis people are doing? Do you think they recognize the Avis people? Yeah. Do you think that they know who shows up on time, clean, and sober versus who comes in looking like the cat drug them in? Yeah. And so what you can do is you can ask the people at, let's say that we bought out, or that we're Hertz and we're buying out Avis. We can ask our employees, hey, who would you choose to bring over from Hertz? And they'll say, oh, Frank, Mary, and Joe, but leave that guy, because they're worthless, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so we would go ahead and just try to hire the employees we wanted. We wouldn't have to fire the ones we did not. By the way, I fully expected trouble on that day that I fired the 79 people, but they were lovely people. This is down in Texas. They crossed the road to a vacant lot, and they had a big barbecue. They didn't invite me, but under the circumstances, I understand. Okay, so now let's talk about some different acquisition classifications. First of all, horizontal acquisitions. This is when they are in the same line of business. For example, Hertz and Avis are both in the car rental company. If they were to get together, that would be a horizontal acquisition. And there's one there from a while back where these two cable companies were trying to get together. By the way, when you try to do a horizontal acquisition, who is likely to give you trouble?
FTC.
Yeah, the FTC, the government. Why?
Potentially create a monopoly.
Yeah, it's a potential to create a monopoly or at the very least reduce competition. And so that's one of the big problems with horizontal acquisitions. Now, of course, there's also the beauty of them because you've got economies of scale, which we'll talk about. Do you think a cable company needs more than one CEO? Absolutely not. Okay, then we have vertical acquisitions, and this is where the target and bidder are at different levels of the value process. So the guy who really brought vertical integration, that is what we're talking about here, vertical integration, was a guy named Rockefeller, and he started out owning oil refineries. He started out somewhere in the whole oil thing, and before the end, he owns the oil well, he owns the refinery, he owns the pipelines, he owns the gas stations, he owns everything in that value chain. Now, do you think there's a benefit, an economic benefit to owning the entire value chain? Absolutely. Now, and you still got competitors, right? You've got competitors at each part along that value chain. One thing I always enjoyed or tried to do with my businesses was to try to maintain control over as much as I could. So, for example, when I'm making safety valves in Dallas, Texas, a lot of the material starts out as just a cylinder, and we've got to put a hole in the middle of it before we can do anything. The drill was not in my organization. The drill was in this other guy's organization, and whose material do you think got drilled first, mine or his? His. And so if I wanted to make sure that I could meet obligations to my customers, I had to have some sort of alternative. And so what did I do? I went out and bought a turret lathe, and an old turret lathe, and turned it into a drill. Now, it was slower, it was louder, it was stinkier, it was all sorts of bad, except for one thing. I was able to control whether or not I could meet the promises to my customers, which is one of the 6 ways that I got measured, right? And so there's value, not only economic value, but there's other values in being able to control the entire chain. So, gas stations, refineries is one of our examples. How about paper? Paper mills. What is the material that we put into paper mills? Trees, right? And so you'll see forestry companies getting snapped up by paper mills or vice versa. In fact, you've probably seen Weyerhaeuser copy paper before, or there's some other brands, but they're actually a forestry company, and they bought paper mills, and then you'll actually see some of these paper mill companies buy office supply places. So it's really the whole the whole supply chain that they're trying to buy. And then we have conglomerate acquisitions. A conglomerate is a firm that's made up of different groups that are doing different things. We talked a little bit about conglomerate acquisition when we were talking about financial ratios. Now, you will, in your strategy class, undoubtedly hear them talk about the benefit of conglomerate diversification. If you are a family-owned business, you can fully pay attention to and believe what the strategy professors tell you. However, if you are a public shareholder, the shareholders own the firm, then you should ignore that advice. And here's why. A conglomerate is a lot like a diversified portfolio. When you add these other things in there, you're reducing the risk, but you're also reducing the returns to the firm. We see over and over again that conglomerates underperform. Conglomerates underperform. In fact, you can take these disparate divisions, and as soon as you put these two weird things together, the total value now drops to less than the value of the individual parts. We see it over and over again. And then on the back side, we see when a conglomerate breaks up, that the parts all added together are worth more than the company was before it came apart. So we know conglomerate acquisition is a bad idea, but people still do it. And they'll stand up and they'll make all sorts of excuses for why it's important. And here's what I want you to know. Executives tend to have a lot of their wealth tied up in the stock of the company. Does that make sense? Because they're getting stock options, stock grants. Now, can the executive just go sell their stock and stuff to buy other stuff to be diversified? What would you think if you heard today that Elon Musk was selling his shares in Tesla? What would you're like, whoa, the rats are getting off the ship, right? And so what are you going to do? You're going to sell your stock too. The share price is going to go down. So it's really kind of difficult for the CEO to sell their stock. Therefore, it's difficult for them to have a diversified portfolio of their own. So instead of diversifying their portfolio, what do? They diversify the firm, right? They diversify the firm to try to get rid of some of that risk. The returns aren't going to be as high for the company, but they really don't care because they're basically protecting their personal wealth. Okay, let's talk about an example here. If I say Sara Lee, what do you think of?
Bread.
Everybody says bread, but it actually, the younger people say bread. It actually started out long before that with pies. Roll back to World War II. Where are our American men? Europe, Asia, right? They're not here. Who is running the factories? Women. And women are receiving pay for doing this. Now, the men come back home from the war. What do the men want back? Their jobs. But some of the women are like, I kind of like this having my own money, right? But, the husband's back from the war. Women, unfortunately, were still expected to do all the women type work, which is what they would have called it at that time, cooking and so forth. So what can mom do? Instead of making a homemade pie, she can go by the store on the way home and pick up a Sara Lee frozen pie. And we see all sorts of convenience foods start to be popular at that time for that very reason. That was the invention of the TV dinner, which really took two things: women working and the invention of television, right? Those were the two things that led to TV dinners. Okay, now, move forward in time. Sara Lee has now basically saturated the frozen dessert market. Not only they're making frozen pies, they're making frozen cakes, and so they decide they need to expand into something else. So they undertake what we would call related diversification, which is where they jump into an area that is next to something they're already doing. So that's when they get into the bakery business with bread. And the customer is the same, right? It's the grocery store. That's their end customer. But is there some difference there? Yes. How long could a Sara Lee frozen pie last in the freezer? Long time. How long does a loaf of bread last on the shelf? It's interesting. It depends on where you're at. When I was, in my house, it'll last 2 weeks. When we get over to China, and we go shopping for bread to make sandwiches, and the loaves are like this big. I'm like, why do these people have such small loaves of bread? And we bring it home, and 2 days later, I figure out why. Because it molds. Now, why is American bread lasting 2 weeks and Chinese bread? Yeah, it's the preservatives, right? Oh yeah, if you've been eating American food and you die, it's really hard for us to tell how long you've been dead because you're just so chock full of preservatives. A Chinese person dies, it's pretty easy to figure out how long they've been gone because they're not eating that garbage. Does that make sense? Okay, that's way off, but back to the story. So, the supply chain is different. It has to be. You can't get by with delivering once a month. You have to be delivering probably twice a week now, right? And so it's different, but it's related. Now, time goes on, And they've basically saturated as much of the bread market as they can get. So they say, well, we need some other sort of related diversification. And so they go out and buy a company called Dewey Egbert. Do you guys know what Dewey Egbert does? Coffee. Everybody knows that coffee goes with pie, right? I can hear the lame argument now. Now, the customers, once again, are the same. It's the grocery stores. The supply chain is a little easier than either of their other products because, it lasts longer on the shelf and whatnot. So they do Dewey Egberts, and they do okay with it. And then they figure out they need more diversification, but by now they've more acquisitions. But by now they've ran out of these ideas for related diversification. So they go out and buy Hanes. What does Hanes make? Underwear. How is underwear related to frozen pies?
Hopefully the people that are buying frozen pies wear underwear.
Okay, you're like, wow, I really like the Sara Lee pies. Maybe I should try their underwear. I'm not seeing it. Now, I will say this. The more Sara Lee pies you eat, the more new underwear you have to purchase, right? Does that make sense? But it just, from a business perspective, doesn't make any sense at all. Do you think someone who's grown up making pies has any idea about underwear? No. The supply chain's totally different, and you're no longer selling them at the supermarket. I have never seen Hanes underwear in the frozen section. I suppose there might be a group that's into that sort of thing, but I haven't seen that. So, long story short, they got into this unrelated diversification. Now, if you had to guess, eventually, what happens with Sara Lee? Do you think they still own Hanes? No. Like almost every conglomerate ever, they come back apart. And when they do, the individual parts are worth more than the whole thing was to begin with. So, we call that the conglomerate discount. Questions?
Would another example be Yamaha making grand pianos and Yamaha making motorcycles?
Yeah! Okay, now this is actually, strangely enough, related diversification. Do you know how they got into, by the way, which did they make first? Pianos, right? You guys, did you know that? They made pianos first. Okay, and to make pianos, you have that big cast iron piece because, by the way, piano wires are under a lot of tension. You've got to have a strong thing to keep them from collapsing, right? And so they become very good at casting, right? Now, it's later on, and they are figuring out what else can we use our casting expertise for. And one of the things they can use their casting expertise for is making blank engines and even frames for motorcycles. And so, strangely enough, pianos and motorcycles sort of related diversification. At least it was something they knew something about, right? Good question. Other questions? Okay. Now let's talk about proxy contest. If you think back to chapter 6, we said that the proxy is how you can give someone else the right to vote your shares. We also have the proxy ballots. So basically, what we're going to do in a proxy contest is instead of trying to buy up the shares to get the votes, we're just going to ask the shareholders to vote for our new slate of directors so we can get rid of the current management. And by the way, who typically starts a proxy contest? Someone that owns a sizable portion of the firm, but not the majority. So, and they want to kind of change the direction of the company, but they don't have enough money to buy the shares. So they basically make a case to the shareholders. Now, let's give you an example of this. Back in 1984, I think it was 84, I'm watching The Wonderful World of Disney on Sunday night, because back then we only had 3 channels. So I'm watching The Wonderful World of Disney, and there's this guy comes on. And he says, "Hello, I'm Michael Eisner, the new CEO of Disney. And I watch him and I'm impressed. I said, Mom, this guy's going places. I mean, I'm like 12 at the time, but I can spot talent, right? Anyway, so sure enough, Michael jumps in there and he starts doing amazing things. And Disney becomes more and more profitable. They grow into more and more areas. They grow, so you've got Shanghai Disney. Actually, that was post-Michael. You got Tokyo Disney, you've got Hong Kong Disney, you got all this international expansion. You've got expansion into different cultures with the cartoons that make them more appealing around the world. And so you've got all sorts of amazing stuff going on there under Michael Eisner. But here's what happens. Over time, just like your professor, Michael gets tired of the whole thing, right? And he's pleased to live a quiet life, right? Do you think he's taking the big gambles anymore? No. Do you think he's putting in the long, hard days? No. And so the stock price starts to... And so they know something needs to be done. But remember the board, they're probably all friends with Michael. They're not willing to call him out. Except for one person, the only person on the board with the last name Disney, a man named Roy Disney, otherwise known to the board as Walt's idiot nephew. They were really mean about Roy Disney. But Roy could see that Disney had lost its way. Eisner was not the guy to help bring him back. And so Roy set out to do a proxy contest where he was trying to get in a slate of directors that would fire Michael Eisner. Now, proxy contests are notoriously hard to win. And Roy's group only got 43% of the shares voted for them. However, 43% sent a very strong message to the existing board. And that message is, if you don't do something with Michael, maybe this time next year, you'll be voted out. Do the directors want to keep their jobs? Absolutely. So what do the directors do? Well, they call Michael Eisner in, and they say, Michael, we are so grateful to have a CEO. He's going to be Michael Eisner. We are so grateful to have a CEO like you. You've been doing a great job. You have created billions of dollars in shareholder wealth, and we thank you. Now, does Michael know about the proxy vote? Oh yeah, it was in the Wall Street Journal, right? Everybody knows 43% of the shares want you gone, right? So, but you're sitting there, this is like poker, right? He's like, well, thank you. And then they say, Michael, you've done such a great job. Here's what we propose. We want to let you have a hand in selecting your successor, and we want to give you a 2-year time period over which you will train your successor and hand over duties one at a time as your successor becomes capable. And at the end of the 2 years, you will give over the last of your responsibilities and you'll become the CEO emeritus. What does emeritus mean? Retired, right? Now, say, but Michael, your knowledge is far, far too valuable for us to just let you go. So here's what we want to do. We want to keep you on a consulting contract for the rest of your life for $2 million a year. What do you say, Michael?
Sure.
Yeah! Now, Michael knows if he doesn't go along, Michael, what do you think's going to happen? Yeah! We're going to fire your ass and you won't have anything, right? So he knows. And this is exactly what Michael Eisner says. Oh, this is a very generous offer. Thank you very much. I'm quite pleased to be moving on to the next stage of my life. I saw him on Good Morning America, or one of those dribble shows shortly thereafter. And they said, what are you doing with your time now that you're retired from Disney? He's like, oh, it's the most fulfilling time of my life. I'm spending time with my grandchildren and writing children's books. By the way, every schmuck thinks they can write a children's book, right? Angelina Jolie, they all do. Okay, he's like, I'm writing children's book. I guarantee you, if at that point his phone had rang and they're like, quick, Michael, come back, we need you, he would have been gone, right? Okay, so that is, even though that proxy test was not successful, it actually did achieve the goal. Let's talk about one that was actually successful. Have any of you ever eaten at the Olive Garden? Yeah, okay. So the Olive Garden, and I forget the name of the group that was went after them, but it was a private equity firm, bought up some shares in the parent company, Darden Restaurants, which also had at the time Red Lobster and some other stuff. Anyway, they buy up those shares, and then they start a proxy contest to get a new slate of directors in. And it was so interesting the way they approached it. They laid out exactly what they would do differently at the Olive Garden, all the way down to salting the pasta. Did you know that in order for pasta to be good, you need to put a little salt in the water? Olive Garden used to put salt in the water for their pasta, and then they bought some new pots and pans. And in order to protect the warranty on those pots and pans, they weren't allowed to use salt. So to protect the warranty on a pan, they start turning out crap pasta. Now, another area where they were in bad shape, the Starlink, something capital, they said you need to pay closer attention to your breadstick discipline. If you go to Olive Garden, and what do they bring you out? They bring you out breadsticks. Now, in the beginning, or 2 decades ago, they would bring them out based on a formula. It was called N+1. So if you've got 8 people at the table, you bring out 9 breadsticks. If you've got 2 people at the table, you bring out 3 breadsticks. And then you just bring more as needed. That way, there isn't waste, and the breadsticks are always fresh and hot. But the servers got lazy, and so what are they doing? Just like cramming a bunch of breadsticks, and here you go, you pigs. And then basically they get cold and greasy, and what ends up happening? Yeah, a lot of waste, right? And so that was another thing they mentioned. It was so funny. My wife and I, 20 years ago, we used to eat at the Olive Garden, and they would bring us 3 breadsticks. And I would always look at the server and say, are you trying to start a fight, right? Because who gets the 2 and who gets the 1? And even if I divided the third one in half, there's undoubtedly going to be a bigger half and a smaller half. And my wife and I are very bold, assertive, right? Because we're Americans, right? Okay, so back to the story. That was another thing. Now, here's the fun thing. They published all this. It was in the Wall Street Journal. You knew exactly what they planned to do if the proxy vote went their way. And it did. And it basically saved the company because they were on a trajectory to the toilet, and then they were able to turn the corner. Questions?
Logistically, like, how is a proxy contest started? Like, how does whoever wants to initiate it, like, make it happen?
Okay, so you have to be able to get the word out. So we're back to the PR newswire, talking to the brokerages, that sort of thing. And people can nominate a slate of directors if they have enough shares. And enough is probably written in the corporate chart, right? And so Roy Disney undoubtedly had enough shares. And the private equity firm that was going after Olive Garden undoubtedly had enough shares that they could propose a slate of directors. And then that's when you have to start, going around and doing the publicity tour and telling people exactly what you're going to do, trying to win them over.
Do you think them publishing that in the Wall Street Journal helped their
Oh,
case?
absolutely, absolutely. And if you were an investor at the Olive Garden and you also ate at the Olive Garden, as you were reading down that list, you're like, yeah, what the hell? Yeah. Like the not salting the pasta? Like, are you high? Go ask any Italian if you need to salt pasta. The answer is an emphatic yes, right? So yeah, very definitely so. I don't think they would have succeeded without it. Other questions?
When getting news out, would media outlets change the way that they phrase stories? So like Jeff Bezos owning Washington Post and Amazon, if something's released about Amazon and Washington Post, spin it in a certain way to guide people's narrative?
Okay, so here's the first thing you need to know about journalists. They are people. And people are scumbags. Yeah, everybody, me included, has their own personal agenda. And so let's assume that I told you a story about a trip my wife wanted to take that I went on versus one that I wanted to take. Do you think that I would tell those stories differently based on my interests? Luckily, we always agree on everything. But yeah, it's gonna come out different. Now, if you intelligent readers, and I'm going to encourage you all to be intelligent readers, read stuff from more than one source, right? If you're getting all your news from MSNBC, you're getting one perspective. If you're getting all your news from Fox, you're getting a different perspective. Maybe read them and everything in between. And if you see common themes among them, perhaps that's the truth, right? Now, the other thing that happens, anytime I read a coverage of Fox in the Wall Street Journal, they always mention that the Wall Street Journal and Fox are both owned by a News Corp. They'll always say that. So if Washington Post is covering Amazon, undoubtedly they'll throw something in there like that. Does the ownership change the way they cover things? Absolutely. I've been reading Newsweek, and at first I was reading Newsweek, and it was somewhere between Fox News and CNN. And then the owner group got kicked out and got swapped out, and suddenly they shift to the left. So what I'm telling you is that all these news outlets, they're all just humans. Every human has an opinion. They all have a perspective. And so read as much of that stuff as you can and come up with your own diversified portfolio of news. I will also tell you to use a diversified portfolio of advice. Students come to me for advice, and I'll tell them something, and they're like, well, that's great, I'm going to go with that. And I'm like, hold it. You need to go ask like 9 other people, because I could be nuts, right? You need to go ask 9 other people, and if you're getting a common thread of advice through the whole thing, then that's probably got some validity to it. Questions? Okay. Now let's talk about going private. So when we first take a firm public through IPO, we call that going public. Going private is the opposite. It's where we get some money and we buy up the stock. We take the firm private and we take it off the market. Now, when we talked about the agency problem, we talked about the agency problem was absolutely the worst at large corporations with atomistic shareholdings, meaning a lot of tiny shareholders. And it's because those people can't properly monitor the CEO. And so a lot of times we'll see, especially with conglomerates, basically they just start wasting money. One of my favorite movies is called Barbarians at the Gate. And it is about a conglomerate, RJR Nabisco. By the way, Nabisco, what do you think of when you think of the name Nabisco? Cookies! What was RJR? Cigarettes! And I can just hear the stupid conversation that led up to this. It's like, you know, these kids are aging out of Oreos. How about Marlboros, right? It's dumb. Okay, but so they had this, that's an obviously conglomerate acquisition, right? Okay, so, and they had some other stupid stuff too. And so now they've got this conglomerate, and the manager is a guy, and he is wasting shareholders' money like crazy. He's throwing all these golf tournaments for his favorite customers and for his favorite employees. He is sending his dog to his estate in Florida on the company jet. And the flight manifest would have the passenger's name as G. Shepherd, because it was a German Shepherd, right? Do you think the shareholders really want to pay for that? No. Okay, so he's wasting money like crazy. This is the perfect opportunity for someone to slip in here and plant a seed. And an investment banker, I've already picked on you today, I'm going to pick on someone else. Mr. Long is our CEO. By the way, Mr. Long, Mr. Long and I have similar backgrounds. Neither one of us are from great family wealth, right? We're just intelligent, hardworking guys who have worked really hard to get where we're at. And now he is living the high life. flying his dog to Florida, playing golf all the time. Who knows what other kinds of crazy crap he's wasting shareholder money on. But I, as an investment banker, come to him and say, Mr. Long, we are a huge fan of what you've been doing here at RJR Nabisco. You're just doing a great job. Now, do you think CEOs have a bit of an ego about them?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think he's lapping this up? Absolutely. I say, Mr. Long, we think there's only one thing that would make this company better. And he says, do say. And I say, you know what, Mr. Long, how would you like to own this company? Mr. Long says, what? He says no, because he's kind of figured out where this is going. But Mr. Long is not arrogant enough yet to be a CEO. He'll get there someday. But if he was a CEO, he would say, I would love to own this company. However, I just don't have the money to buy it. And me, the investment banker, I say, don't worry. We will get you the money. We will issue a bunch of junk bonds. Oh, wait, high yield bonds. We'll issue a bunch of high yield bonds, and we'll use the assets of the firm as the collateral. Mr. Long says, how can you borrow against something that you don't own? And I say, well, when you bought your house, did you own it? And he says, no. Did you borrow against that house? Yes. That's what we're going to do with RJR Nabisco. We're just going to borrow against the assets of the firm, and you'll be able to take this thing private. And then you'll be in charge. And by the way, for my trouble, all I want is 10% of the stock when this is all said and done. That's all I want. Right? Plus, the investment banking fees. But we'll negotiate those later. I'll cut you a deal. Okay, now, so Mr. Long lets this roll around in his head, and he reaches out to me. I don't have to reach back out to him. He's going to reach out to me. He's like, I've been thinking that's an excellent idea. Why don't we go ahead with that? And so what do? I get the ball rolling, and then eventually, now the story's a little different in the movie, but in our story, we're going to say about Mr. Long actually succeeds, and he ends up buying the firm. Now, we're going to call this either an MBO, which is a management buyout, because he's a manager of the firm that buys it out, or an LBO, a leveraged buyout, because all that money that he borrowed to buy this thing, it's leverage, right? That's why we call it a leveraged buyout. Okay, now here's the fun thing. We succeed. Mr. Long is now the owner, or the primary owner of the firm. And we have a big party, we drink a lot of champagne, we talk about how freaking great everything's going to be, and the next morning, Mr. Long wakes up and he's got a really bad headache. And it's not just from the champagne. He not only has an alcoholic hangover, he has a debt hangover. Because he realizes that 6 months from today, he's got one of those big high yield coupons due, right? And so what does he do? He jumps in a Bentley and he goes down to corporate headquarters, and he's there at 7:30 a.m. His assistant nearly has a heart attack. She says, Mr. Long, I haven't seen you here this early in years. He says, I've got lots of work to do. And so then he settles down and he starts to figure out how in the world he's going to start making these coupon payments. Now let's talk about the sorts of things that he does. Number one, he thinks about what divisions he can sell to raise cash. And he's going to use that cash to buy back some of these bonds to lower the amount that coupon's going to be. Number two, he starts looking at where he can cut costs. Because he's trying to figure out, how am I going to generate enough cash to cover that coupon? And so all of this is happening because of that debt. All of it's happening because of the debt. And in fact, we call this the disciplining effect of debt. Have you guys, now, not this recent Snow White movie, but the good one from 1937. What do the seven dwarfs do for a living?
They're minors.
They're miners! And every day when they go off to work with their little stuff on, their shoulders, what do? They sing! And what do they sing? Hi-ho.
It's off to work we go.
Okay, so here we go. Hi-ho, hi-ho, it's off to work we go. The disciplining effect of debt looks like this. I owe. How far could I go? This morning, I woke up, the alarm goes off, and I said, I don't want to go in there today. And I feel a sharp jab in my butt. That's my wife. She says, we've got a mortgage. Haul your ass out of bed. By the way, this is a bullshit story, but that's the disciplining, that's the disciplining effect of debt. Okay, now, not only do we have Mr. Long now has to make this payment, let's talk about the agency problem. When Mr. Long wastes $1 now, how much does it cost him?
Whatever it is to me.
Yeah, so let's say it's 90% him, 10% me, it's going to cost him 90 cents. Do you think he's going to be a whole lot more careful with the money now than he used to be? Yeah. Do you think I have to follow him around with a sharp stick to get him to do what's right? Hell no, he's got a 90% interest in doing so, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so we've basically eliminated the agency problem, and we have instituted this disciplining effect of debt. Questions?
So say like a manager takes it private, do they ever go back public?
Oh
How
yeah,
often does that
we see
happen?
this. We see this going back and forth. So, and in fact, usually if they, like private equity takes a firm private, they'll take it private and then they'll try to like rebuild it. They'll try to fix the problems, and then they'll turn around and sell it because they're really not in the business long term of running these things. With management buyouts, that's less likely, but it's still possible. Let's assume that you go ahead and you succeed buying out the firm. When you hit 65 or 70 years old, are you still going to be wanting to do that? No. And so at that time, going public makes a lot of sense, right? You're able to cash out. Now, if you watch the movie Barbarians at the Gate, I'm going to tell you two things. There is nudity and foul language, but it's all like 1980s level of nudity and foul language, so it's really not that bad. Then the other thing is that at the end, the very final scene of the movie, you see the CEO and his wife, they're in first class. They're not on a private plane anymore. And G. Shepard is down below in the cargo hold. And as they show the dog, you can hear the CEO say, we're all having to make sacrifices. It's a beautiful movie. You should watch it. Questions? Okay, so someone asked last time about, I forget what it was you asked about, but we came under the idea of alternatives to mergers. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the strategic alliance. And that is where two companies agree to work together for the common benefit of both companies. Now, they're not forming a new company, they're not investing in each other per se, but they are agreeing to work together. The most common one that we hear about, most common example, are airlines. Airlines. So I get a call, this is 1998, I get a call in the afternoon in Dallas, Texas. They tell me to grab my passport, grab the bag, and go to the airport that there's trouble at the plant in Scotland. And so I get on American Airlines in Dallas, Texas, and I fly into London Gatwick. And then my next flight says it's AA 6147. And I'm looking around for AA 6147 and I can't find it. And I finally ask this pleasant looking woman, and she tells me, oh, that's a code share. It'll actually be British Airways 6147. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And so I go and I get on the plane, and I can tell you two interesting things about that plane ride. Number one, free beer. It's a domestic flight with free beer. That was interesting. And they also gave us little sandwiches. And number two was, as soon as the plane broke through the clouds over London, you could tell who was local and who wasn't, because all the people who lived there were doing this. Because like they hardly ever see the sun, right? Okay. Now, the question, can you testify?
My boyfriend was like, I didn't see the sun the entire trip we were there over Christmas. He was looking for it.
Yep. Okay, now, why did that happen? And it's because it's not worth it to be British Airways to build out a domestic network within the United States. It's not worth it to American Airlines to build out a domestic network within the UK, but they can hand passengers off to each other. And of course, your frequent flyer miles, in theory, work both ways. I've hardly ever had that really work out, but that's the idea. Now let's talk about a strategic alliance that you might actually be familiar with the product. What kind of transmission does your car have in it? Automatic?
Yes.
Yeah. How many speeds?
6 feet.
6 speed? Really? You don't know?
Actually, no.
He doesn't know. Okay, I'm going to tell you. It's a 10 speed. I think it is. Anyway, long story short, whether it is or not. GM and Stellantis now decide that they're going to work together to come up with a new transmission. And that transmission is a 10-speed automatic transmission. By the way, why do you have more gears in a transmission? To improve fuel efficiency. That's the only reason you're going to go with 10 speeds. It's not like a bicycle. Okay, back to the story. Why do they not individually want to develop their own transmission? It's very expensive to do so, right? Also, is it a point of differentiation between cars? Do people say, ooh, that's got that Chrysler 10-speed transmission, I want that one? No, people typically don't even pay attention. Only nerds like me know who manufactured the transmission in their car, right? And I'm here to tell you the ZF 8-speed automatic transmission is the bomb, right? It's great. Back to the story. So they work together, and it's not going to give either one of them a competitive advantage, but they're able to split the costs of development. So that's another strategic alliance. Now let's talk about joint ventures. And a joint venture is where two firms put up money and or assets to establish another firm. If you roll back to the 1970s, Toyota is manufacturing highly fuel efficient cars with high quality and low prices. GM is manufacturing gas guzzlers with crappy quality and high prices. Now, why in the world would Toyota choose to work with GM? Because they want to start manufacturing in the United States. Because, once again, tariffs, right? They want to manufacture in the United States to avoid tariffs, but they don't know how to deal with unions. They don't know how to deal with American suppliers, and so they jump into bed with GM to try to figure that out. Now, what does GM get out of this thing? GM learns how to build cars that aren't crap, cars that don't suck gas, and cars that are cost efficient. And so they both have a motivation to get into this. So what does GM put into it? GM puts into it their Fremont, California plant. Why did they choose the Fremont plant? It was the worst plant they had. It was the worst plant they had. Typically, half the workforce was missing after lunch because they would go out on lunch and get high. Because remember, it's California, right? Okay, so they had a lot, and especially if you bought a car that was made after lunch, the quality was just crap. Because even the people that came back to work were high. Okay, so Toyota, what do they put into it? They bring in their model of the car that's going to be built. They come in and they do the production process, and they also introduce General Motors to the concept of free lunch. Now, why free lunch? Where were the people getting high at? Yeah, they're leaving the factory at lunch and getting high, and then coming back. Well, what if I just offer them free food? Maybe they stick around and they won't get high. And it worked. And there were all sorts of amazing things like that that Toyota taught GM. Now, moving forward in time, this is a successful joint venture for both of them. Toyota figures out how to manufacture in the United States, so they've got lots of factories in the U.S. today. That experiment in Fremont was the first, right? And GM learned something about making fuel-efficient quality cars and about keeping stoners on site during lunch. What do you think is going on in that very building today? Any ideas? Oh, by the way, GM went bankrupt, and it was in the joint venture agreement that if one of the partners went bankrupt, the other one could walk away. Do you think Toyota walked away? Oh, yeah. Now, Martha Stewart had a joint venture with Kmart. When Kmart went bankrupt, do you think Martha Stewart walked away? She should have, but she didn't. Dumbest thing she ever did. Smartest thing she ever did was working with Snoop Dogg. Now, back to the story. Okay, so they walk away, and that leaves GM with the building. GM goes bankrupt, and the factory gets sold at auction. Who buys it? Elon Musk! Tesla's. That was Tesla's first plant, right? It was right there in that same crappy stoner plant where GM and Toyota once worked together. Okay, so that's one joint venture. Let me tell you about one other one. And this was in Halliburton, my old company, in Russia. At the end of the Cold War, the Russian Red Army pulled back from all those countries in Eastern Europe, and they had a bunch of surplus trucks left over. At the same time, all of their oil field production, which had been neglected under the communists, it needs to be rejuvenated. And one of the things that we did at Halliburton was what's called well stimulation, which is where you pump chemicals at pressure into the well to try to make it to where it'll make more oil and gas. And so stimulation was a big business there. And there were all these mom and pop stimulation companies that were popping up. We had all these leftover pumps from the last oil boom. And so we did a joint venture with a guy who bought up a bunch of these Russian Army trucks. And we had an operation just outside of Moscow where we were marrying our pumps to his trucks and selling them to these mom and pop operations. And that went on until we ran out of, I forget if we ran out of pumps or trucks first, but whichever one we ran out of, that was the end of the joint venture. We sold the assets, split the money, and headed in our separate ways. Now, I'm going to tell you one aspect of doing business internationally that you need to be aware of. My buddy Andy, who grew up in Oklahoma on the farm, went to Oklahoma State. He was the guy that we sent over to get this thing set up in Russia. And when he came back, he looked like he'd been a prisoner of war. He was in really, really bad shape. I mean, he was freaked out. I'm like, Andy, what's up? He said, man, the Russians are crazy. I said, what do you mean? He said, do you know how Russians close a business deal? And I said, no. He said, well, first, you get really, really drunk. Vodka, right? He says, and then you strip off naked and you all sit together in the sauna. He says, and you beat each other with tree limbs. I'm like, what the hell? He says, oh, that's not the worst of it. He says, when you get through beating with each other with tree limbs, then you go out and jump in the icy water. He says, this is how you close a business deal in Russia. Do I have anybody here from Eastern Europe or Central? Do you guys have similar? Where you beat each other with trees?
This just seems like normal.
That seems normal. I am so glad you're here to share that because sometimes American students think I'm lying.
It's not as violent as it used to be.
Oh, okay.
It's not as violent as it sounds, I guess.
Yeah, but you're not Russian, are you?
I'm from Belarus.
Belarus. Okay, close. Yeah. Okay, so maybe Andy was, but keep in mind, Andy was from Central Oklahoma, right? To him, this is some far out shit, right? Thank you for testifying. Okay. I had a colleague who had to go close a business deal in China, and they told him he either had to drink snake blood or sing karaoke. What do you think he chose? Karaoke. And he was so good they invited him back for the next night. Okay, let's talk about taxability of acquisitions. Acquisitions are taxable to the target shareholder if they are selling the shares for more than they paid for them if they're getting cash. So let's say I paid $20 a share and now you're going to buy my shares for $30 a share. I have a $10 capital gain that I've got to pay a tax on. However, if you give me shares in the new firm instead of cash, I don't have to pay capital gains taxes because I'm simply thought to be exchanging equity in one firm for equity in another. So it's just purely an exchange of equity. there is no capital gain and therefore no tax to the target shareholder. Generally, cash acquisitions are taxable. The only time I can think of when they wouldn't be is if you are selling your shares for less than you paid for them. For example, when Yahoo eventually gets bought out by Verizon, which by the way was a stupid acquisition, the per share price that those people got was probably lower than what they paid for their Yahoo shares. Questions? Okay, now we talked about the tax-free acquisition being an exchange. First of all, the acquisition has to be for business purposes, not just to evade paying taxes. I am going to teach you how to do acquisitions to avoid paying taxes. However, that cannot be the primary purpose. So when you see the announcement get made, it always sounds like something like this. We are fusing our two great companies together because we know we can achieve synergies because of our complementary product lines. And we can also achieve economies of scale. By the way, anytime you hear me say economies of scale, know that somebody is losing their job, right? And, by the way, there will be a slight tax benefit. And I put that at the very end, and I say it kind of in fine print to make it sound like it's not the major reason that we're doing this. And by the way, it shouldn't be, or it would be illegal. Oh, it wouldn't be illegal, but we would have to pay taxes. Now, the other thing is that we've got this continuation of equity interest. And so that's what we just talked about. I exchange my shares for more shares instead of cash. So that's how I make an acquisition tax-free. Now let's talk about how we account for acquisitions. Back in the old day, and in fact I was involved in a merger where we did the purchase accounting method, and that is where, it was pooling of interest I was involved in. And that was just where they add all of the accounts together on the balance sheet and everything. So if one company had 200,000 in assets and the other one had 600,000, you add them together and now there's 800,000. That is illegal now. Now what we have to do is the purchase accounting. And that is where we go out and we buy the firm, and then we have to determine the fair market value of the firm's assets, which if you ever need someone to figure out fair market value of assets, give me a call. My rate is a very low $2,000 an hour. Bring me in. You bring in someone from the outside. That's my point. You bring in someone from the outside to evaluate what is the fair value of these assets. And then you add all those fair values up. We take that number and subtract it from the purchase price, and the difference that you see is called goodwill. That's what you pay over and above the fair market value of the assets. Now, why in the world would I pay over and above the fair market value of the assets? What does the firm have going for it other than just the assets?
That's brown.
Yeah, the brand. Let's think about Apple. Does Apple have value far, far beyond the value of its actual assets? Apple's actually a fairly assets-like company. Do they own their own factories? No. They've got that big, freaky spaceship headquarters. That's one of their biggest assets. But other than that, they're kind of an asset-like company. But the company is worth a boatload of money. So the extra money would go into this account called goodwill. Now, that goodwill has to be examined yearly to see if it's been impaired. What kinds of things would lead to impaired goodwill? I'll give you an example. Shoe brand, Adidas, was doing business with a guy named Kanye West. You guys know who Kanye West is? Now, Kanye West, they had bought his little shoe business. What was the name of the shoe business?
Yeezy.
Yeezy. Now, when they bought that, the fair market value of the assets was probably pretty low. Everything else that they paid for that had to be considered goodwill. Now, what happened?
It's like a Nazi.
Yeah, Kanye's a Nazi, right? I don't know that he's a Nazi. Occasionally says he is. Who knows, right? But I do know this. Is Kanye as popular as he was? No. What do you think had to happen to the goodwill on their investment? Had to write it down to zero. If they could go negative, they probably would have. Any questions? Okay, next time we will start with the gains from acquisitions.